I started meditating way back in 1974 when I was in India. I met with my first teacher was actually a Theravadan Buddhist monk, a Burmese monk by the name of Munindraji, and he was living and teaching in Bodh Gaya in the state of Bihar, which is one of the poorest states in India. But Bodh Gaya is also very symbolic of the place where the Buddha sat under the Bodhi tree and attained awakening. So I happened to stumble into that place when I was 20 years old, having no idea what I was stumbling into, and met with Munindraji and started meditation. And the first Dharma talk that I ever heard was on the Four Noble Truths. And when I heard that Dharma talk, I again was very moved, deeply moved, and there was just tears streaming down my face. And it was as if I was hearing bells in the distance, temple bells kind of ringing, that just really affirmed to me that it's exactly what I needed. And so that began my long love affair with the Buddha Dharma. From there, from Bodh Gaya, I then traveled to Nepal, Kathmandu, and studied with the Tibetan Lamas, doing another 30-day retreat, which was Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa. Lama Yeshe was still alive in those days. He was a great big friendly bear of a man who just irradiated this incredible smile and joyfulness, the joyful Buddha, I used to refer to him as. And but the Tibetan retreat, while I learned a lot, I also, month-long Lamrim retreat, Tibetan Buddhism seemed very esoteric and a brocade and a bit like the Catholic Church of Buddhism in some ways, with all their rituals and bells and visualizations, which didn't really appeal to me. As much as I loved the lamas, the practice itself was not very appealing, and all I wanted to do is understand the nuts and bolts of meditation. So I then went right across India, and I'd heard about Goenkaji, and so I signed up for another 20-day retreat, intense Vipassana retreat with Goenka. And I found I was much more at home, and it resonated deeply with me, this deep foundations of mindfulness and that practice. Yeah, so then that went on. I went on after that. I went back to Burma and Mother Sayama, and then came back to Australia. So the first 6 months in India was just practicing, moving from one monastery to the next, really trying to immerse myself in Buddhist meditation practices and retreats.
In Australia, Theravada teachers of meditation such as Kantipalo, Lawrence Mills, and Ilse Lederman, Ayakema, were giving Buddhist or Buddhist influence courses in the mid-70s in Australia that were attended by a variety of people from different practice traditions, including insight meditation. I understand that your particular insight lineage started with a retreat given by Christopher Titmuss in the Channon in northern New South Wales in 1976.
Yes, that's certainly when I met Christopher. But actually, I attended the very first Buddhist retreat in Australia, which was actually organised by Ilse Lederman, who later became the nun Ayakema. And so Ilse had organised this retreat at Whopper Falls up in Queensland. And that was my first Buddhist retreat back here in Australia. And that's where I also met, at the end of that retreat, a founding member of Dharmananda community, Dudley Leggett, happened to be on that retreat. And he got up at the end of the retreat and talked about how he wanted to build a meditation retreat centre on the land that they had at the Channon in the northern part of New South Wales. And in hearing that, that just kind of was, oh, well, that's what I wanted to do. You know, I'd come back from India with a kind of, you know, fire in my belly and flame in my heart to kind of really engage with meditation practices and back here in Australia. And so the thought of a group of people building a forest retreat centre, meditation centre was yeah, what I wanted to do. And so I left Sydney, signed up for that. So I lived on Dhammananda for a year and a half, and that first year was very much about learning alternative lifestyle and community and organic gardening and building and a whole range of kind of things, making bread, milking cows and so on, which was the life on the farm. And meanwhile, we were slowly, and they were slowly building the Forest Retreat Centre. And it was actually on Dhammananda that I also then met John Seed. And John Seed, because there was a lot of community liaison, people would travel and to each other's communities and have community work days and just hang out and kind of share information and knowledge. So John Seed came to Dhammananda, and I really resonated with John, and he talked about Christopher Titmuss, that he'd met this monk in Dharamsala, and that he wanted to bring Christopher to Australia and organize that retreat. It was very shortly after that that John then asked me if I would take on board the organizing of this retreat for Christopher Titmuss, and a person that I'd never met. But I put up my hand and said yes. And so meanwhile, we were also trying to build the Forest Retreat Centre as a venue to hold these retreats. So this was all happening concurrently. So this was in 1975 when we invited Christopher to Australia, and he did come to Australia, and a group of people, it took sort of almost 9 months to build the Forest Retreat Centre. And Christopher had heard about sort of a group of people organising and building this Forest Retreat Centre for his retreats. And so he sent a group of Westerners, Australians, who had gathered around him in Dharamsala in India, and he said, go and help that woman over there. So, you know, people started coming, and there was this amazing group of people who ended up in the forest, living and working together in the forest, building the Forest Retreat Centre, organising the first retreats with Christopher. So it was one of the most extraordinary, amazing times of my life. Yeah.
Understand that your involvement in Zen started a few years after that. How did that experience contrast with insight meditation?
Yeah, look, on those first retreats with Christopher, I did have some powerful experiences. I loved the teachings. I had been practicing fairly intensely for a couple of years up until that point, but there was certain teachings and Dharma talks that Christopher gave that just opened my mind and opened my heart, and I had some powerful experiences, insight experiences. But then Christopher left and went back to England, and in some ways I fell into a funk. I really was quite distressed in some level. I had these powerful experiences, but then, you know, I had nobody to talk to about that. And I didn't feel it was appropriate to talk to my friends on the community. And so I didn't know how to integrate these experiences, powerful opening experiences. So some friends of mine at Dhammananda had told me about Robert Aitken Roshi coming to Australia. So I thought, right, I need a teacher. I really, really need a teacher. I'm kind of stuck. I'm not quite sure what's happening to me. I need guidance. So I decided to go to Sydney, drive down to Sydney and meet Aiken Roshi and check him out, and which I did. And I used to be sort of asked the most difficult questions I could ever think of for teachers in those days. I particularly needed a teacher who I felt had a Dharma eye, who had a wisdom eye, and some deep sense of awakening. So I checked him out, and I really felt a deep, deep trust with Aiken Roshi, and I felt he understood what was happening to me and my experience that I shared with him. And so I signed up for my first Zen retreat a couple of days later. So that also was a very powerful experience and a heart-opening, mind-opening experience. So that, I think that was in 1979, and that experience with Aiken Roshi paved the way for a long-term relationship with Zen practice, right up until today.
As a teacher of both Zen and insight meditation, you're leading students into traditional and structured Asian heritages that have both been adapted for a Western context. Do you find that the two traditions attract different types of students?
Yes, they do in many ways, and it's a curious thing. Zen seems to attract a lot more, somewhat more intellectual, academic orientated students, and also artists and poets and creative types. Because you've got Zen and the arts is a very strong flavor in the Zen tradition, comes out of that heritage of Zen and the way of the brush, Zen of Zen haiku, Zen and the art of tea making, and so on. So you've got the arts bring a flavor to the Zen tradition of creativity and spontaneity. It's also curious that because Zen works with a practice of primary koans, primary deep, deep questions that we use in contemplation to open the mind. And so even though they're quite confounding and you cannot figure it out with your mind, and yet it's curious that people have a strong intellectual orientation are very attracted to that. And there's the barrier right there in their face, sort of, so to speak, in the practice. With the insight tradition, it's slightly more of a secular frame. It tends to lack ritual and formalities. It's not quite as rigorous as the kind of Zen tradition. So you get there's a lot more people involved in the insight tradition. A lot more people turn up at insight retreats, and so there's a lot more variety. It tends to attract psychologists and social workers and the health profession and yoga teachers and things like that, because it's more akin to that style, if you like, slightly more secular style in its orientation. So even though there are different types of people, of course, there's a lot of similarities too, but the essence of the two traditions is very much the same. The heart of the teachings is the same. It's just a different styles, different flower arrangements,
What are the sort of differences in approach that you might take as a teacher to the two different traditions when you're teaching? How do you approach them yourself? What's different about the way you approach them?
Well, again, at the heart of the teachings of the Buddha Dharma is the same awakening, and but they are, I suppose, one of the metaphors I have is that they are like two different flower arrangements, or two different meals. They're choreographed in a slightly different way, the practices and the emphasis is slightly different. So you've got Insight tradition, Theravadan tradition offers Thai curry and rice, and the Zen tradition offers sushi and rice, and it's the same essential rice, just does have a different flavor. So when I'm in the Zen tradition for a long time, both these paths were running concurrently in my life right from the beginning, in a way. So sometimes I would do Zen retreats, sometimes I do insight retreats. And when I was in the Zen world, I would just immerse myself in the Zen practice. And when I was in the insight tradition, I just immerse myself in the insight tradition. And clearly they have different, there is different emphases. Like, for example, the two primary practices in the Zen tradition are koan practice and also what's called silent elimination practice, or shikantaza in Japanese. And in the insight tradition, it's based on the 4 foundations of mindfulness. So there's very sophisticated, wonderful instructions in the insight tradition of the 4 foundations of mindfulness and how you develop that training of mindfulness into examining and inquiring into our experience, which leads also to what's called choiceless moment-to-moment awareness practice. Now, choiceless moment-to-moment awareness practice is a primary practice in the insight tradition, but it's also the same shamatha vipassana is the same as what we call silent illumination practice in the Zen tradition. So at a certain level, there's a lot of crossover, if you know what I mean, but they have different approaches in different directions. The benefits of the 4 foundations of mindfulness on the insight tradition is that it's a lot more sort of, it's more sophisticated in terms of healing and directing your attention into the psychological, emotional processes and our reactivity and our emotional pain and difficult states of mind. So you really get to examine that from a place of calmness and stillness, to examine this whole mind-body process. Whereas in the Zen tradition, they're not interested in the contents of the consciousness, not interested in the contents of the mind at all. It's just kind of almost go straight to the core, go straight to consciousness itself. What is this? And who am I really? What is the nature of awareness? It's like the questions hone into the depth of the being, so to speak. So very different approaches, yeah.
Subhana, you're also a Hakomi trained therapist with postgraduate qualifications in psychology, and you're working with people in private practice. I wanted to ask you, given the boom in research and therapy that we've seen with the mindfulness movement in the past decade, what's your view about the growth of these relatively new mindfulness practices in relation to both your Zen and insight practices?
It's a very interesting area of discussion, and there's a lot of different conflicting views about this. And the growth of mindfulness is both wonderful, and yes, it has been included in a lot of, integrated into a lot of psychology and psychotherapy. The Hakomi psychotherapy that I am trained in is also uses mindfulness as the base of therapy. So we do therapy within a mindfulness context. And that's powerful and liberating and very healing. And of course, you've got MBSR practices and training throughout the world. You've got mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapy that is very helpful in prevention of relapse in anxiety and depression, and so on. And so you've got a range of therapies that are including mindfulness in that therapeutic modality. While there is great benefits there, clearly some of the concerns that Buddhist teachers have is that when you take mindfulness out of an eightfold path, out of a holistic path that has an ethical framework, a philosophical framework of, and integrate it into the Eightfold Path, you take a technique out of that, you take one part of that out of that, then clearly you can, you can water down the teachings. Clearly there's a problem, because mindfulness is then, it's not integrated into a holistic kind of training. And so there is a range of issues that emerge out of that. When mindfulness is located and integrated back into the Eightfold Path, it's paired with concentration and inquiry and right effort. It's used in a different purpose, not just for healing this whole body and mind, if you like, and at the individual level, but it's used for a much more powerful kind of purpose of deconstructing the self. So it examines the very, very foundation of who we think we are. And so it's liberation. Mindfulness in that context, in that spiritual context, is liberation from the burden of the self, and it opens the consciousness. So, in some ways, psychotherapy is great for healing and it's great for trauma and pathology, but the Buddhist practices are a much bigger ballpark, a much bigger field, and have a slightly deeper purpose, in my view.
Given that you've also launched a meditation teacher training institute, can you highlight the most important considerations for anyone seeking to train as a meditation teacher?
Yes, I think this is very important. That, for one thing, a couple of things come to mind, but for one point is that for a teacher training, then it needs to be also that teachers need to have a very established daily practice. And this was born out of some of John Kabat-Zinn's research, actually. When I did my master's, I reviewed his 3-year clinical follow-up trial from his earlier research in mindfulness from the pain management clinic in Barre, Massachusetts. And so what he realized in the follow-up work, after he had trained a number of teachers to conduct mindfulness and in the MBSR program, and that had spread out across the States at that time, they weren't getting the same results. And so he wondered about why they weren't getting the same results for the same techniques, for the same work that he had developed. And so what he realized was that the teachers, the trainers, they were teaching more from a theoretical kind of point of view. They weren't immersed in the practice. They didn't have a daily practice. So he insisted after that his teachers would need to establish a daily practice, and that they would also need to attend regular retreats. And this actually then made the huge difference, because they were not just teaching from that theoretical kind of objectivity, but also from a direct experience, personal experience. So that's one thing that I think is very important in any kind of training of mindfulness or meditation, that it has to have been from your own direct experience, the benefits, and then it just flows naturally and freely. It's authentic. The second thing that I think is important here is that mindfulness alone is just simply not enough. Just training in mindfulness, even though mindfulness is a powerful technique, and clearly there's wonderful benefits that we know come from these practices of mindfulness, but in my view, mindfulness needs to be paired with the boundless heart teachings, the Brahma Viharas, it's called in the Theravadan tradition, of love, compassion, joy, and equanimity. They're called the four immeasurable qualities of the mind in the Zen tradition, in the Mahayana. Same teachings. And so when those practices are paired with mindfulness, you get a very different combination. You get a powerful combination for healing and liberation, in my view. And I don't think it's just my view. There's a certain amount of research now on compassion and the boundless heart qualities coming out of Stanford University. Professor Doherty set up the institute there for, I think it's called CARE, Compassion and Altruism Research and Education Centre at Stanford. And they've been doing a lot of research on compassion. So the compassion research and studies are kind of almost on par now with the mindfulness kind of research and evidence-based medicine studies. And so we can see when the combination of mindfulness and compassion are paired together, are braided together, there's even more powerful effects. And of course, they were never separated in the tradition, but that's the problem when you take a technique out of a holistic path and just focus on one technique. You water down and you lose aspects of the rest of the teachings. So putting that back together is, I think, a very important part, and that's what I'm attempting to do in the 2-year teacher training, mindfulness and compassion teacher training course that I've developed under the Institute for that very reason.
You're deeply involved in what the Vietnamese teacher Thich Nhat Hanh once described as socially engaged Buddhism. You've been conducting eco-dharma courses and connecting with First Nations people to study deep listening practices such as Didiri as part of your Zen and Insight training. Why is it important for meditators to become involved in these practices?
There's a couple of questions there, and I'd like to kind of first address the eco-dharma and that relationship between the Zen and particularly Indigenous culture and practices, and then why is it important? So I'll come back to the second part of that question. But there is an interesting, now more recent history. The Zen Centre particularly has been interested in doing workshops and seminars and one-day workshops with Uncle Max Dillmanma he's an Aboriginal elder from the South Coast, and he is a lineage holder of 2 different lineages and dreaming stories. And so the Zen Centre has had an interesting relationship there where we've done combined workshops and also spent days with Uncle Max wandering through the Royal Southern National Park and so on. And so wanting to map and kind of what are the similarities and what are the differences and what can we learn from each other. And it's certainly there is some very strong overlaps here around this deep sense of interconnectedness that Aboriginal people hold with everything, with the great nature. And so there is this beautiful relationship that's slowly developing there. And also their practice of Didiri that you mentioned. The Didiri means a deep listening. And Miriam Rose Ungama, who is an Aboriginal elder from the Daly River region in the Northern Territory, who's been awarded some very important awards there for her work. But she teaches Didiri, which means deep listening, which is, as she says, like a contemplation, a deep, quiet inner stillness and awareness and contemplation, where all things, the river and the mountain and all things, you feel connected to all things and a deep sense of peace that arises from that kind of contemplation and deep listening. So there are resonance there, and I feel like we're just at the beginning of that kind of journey in many ways, in turning towards our First Nations people and learning from them. So yeah, I was also privileged, I suppose, in the teachers that I've had, both Aiken Roshi, Christopher Titmuss, in both my traditions, different traditions. Aiken Roshi was an peace activist, and he was also set up the International Fellowship of Reconciliation. He was protest again in the anti-Vietnam War by not paying his taxes, and by refusing to pay your taxes in the States is quite a big deal. And so that was his protest against the war. He could have gone to jail for that, but he said he was a pacifist, and he was very much part of the Quaker movement there. Christopher Titmuss has also been very strongly involved in environmental, social, and political issues right from the get-go. So it's interesting. And then Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, who was my teacher, was also spearheaded the engaged Buddhism as well in the Zen tradition and in the West. And he adopted that slogan, "There is no way to peace, peace is the way." So that became a slogan for engaged Buddhism. And that was really significant to me. So I've had good role models. In other words, I've had very powerful, good role models that engaged Buddhist practice was always intimately part of one's practice. It wasn't separated. Also learnt enormous amount from Bernie Glassman Roshi, who was a Zen teacher in the States, and he set up the Peacemaker Order. He used to do sesshins, street sesshins, where you actually sit on the streets with the homeless and under bridges and sort of sit in the parks, and you don't sit in the nice fancy zendo with your cushions and sleeping bag. You spend 7 days with the homeless on the streets. It's called street sesshin. So he designs sesshins, retreats, what he called plunges into the very cracks in our society. And so he used to do also retreats in some of the most traumatized places on this planet, in Birkenau and in Poland and Auschwitz, where the concentration camps. So he actually did retreats right in those places and brought together powerful kind of, Germans and the Jews and people from all over the world would come to those retreats for reconciliation and healing. So I feel like this is a vein that runs very deeply through my teachers, through my lineage, but also for me, it touches my heart very deeply. And I continue to be involved in that.
Given that in Australia, over the last 50 years or so, we've absorbed mainly Asian Buddhist influenced practices, do you think there's a sense in any way that we may be coming of age in a meditation in Australia, and that we might see a unique, albeit adapted, Australian meditation tradition? And what might that look like?
Well, that's exciting. I don't know exactly what it will look like, but I do think you're right. I do think that there is certainly a type of meditation or a style of meditation that is emerging here in Australia that is different from our Western counterparts, from our American and or English centres and traditions over there. And I think that's because there is, as we connect deeply with our own First Nations people and Indigenous cultures, there's something that combination, there's the different flavour Buddhism that's emerging out of the ground, out of this very soil. And I think for a long time we were orientated, as you said, for the very much Asian traditions, looking overseas from Asia, where we inherited a large part of our Buddhist meditation practices. And now we're sort of opening the mind to looking into our own backyard and celebrating and honoring and respecting that there's deep wisdom here too. And so that what shape that's going to take, I don't know, but it's very exciting. And I feel like these teachings of interconnectedness and the kind of way in which Indigenous culture has cared for country is so much needed right now, for the huge issues that we face, environmental crisis and global warming and climate change and the ecological crisis that we're sitting in right now. I think that relationship is actually going to be very, very significant and important, and in how we address climate change, even in the ways we think about that. Yeah. So yes, there is. I think there's an emerging kind of Buddha Dharma here and meditation in Australia that is, I think it will have its own unique flavor. One little story I wanted to share around that was because I've just come back from doing a Zen retreat, 7-day Zen retreat, teaching out at our temple, Kodoji, out at Gorex past St. Albans. And the Zen Centre has 40 acres there, and there's incredible upper McDonald, past St. Albans, in the upper McDonald ranges, up Forgotten Valley it's called, surrounded by sandstone cliffs, and the nature there is phenomenal, beautiful. New moon, the bird calls, the chorus, the cacophony of bird song in the early morning. And one of the things that I experienced not so long ago when I was doing a retreat up there was, because in the Zen tradition we have lots of bells and clappers and big bell gongs, and it's somewhat musical kind of instruments we have for calling people to the meditation hall and so on. And one morning, early morning, I heard these bells and gongs and clappers and kind of this sound coming from the bush. And I was about to get up and go to the dojo, but it was like, no, that's not the right time to go to the dojo. It's too early. What's happening? And then I realized that it was a lyrebird, and making all these sounds, copying the sounds of the bells and the instruments and the chanting and the, and then the lyrebird would make copy the sound of the chainsaw and things like that. It's just like, and it was something about that was just so special and precious that I thought, right, Zen has landed in Australia. The lyrebird is singing, the sounds that we make, in session. So I guess that was just symbolic. It's a symbolic and a metaphor for the different flavor, if you like. When the natives and the lyrebirds start, copying those sounds, that feels extraordinary somehow. It feels extraordinary to me. Yeah. So it's like, I guess, watch this space,